Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, April 13th, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized a secretive program that would come to be one of the most controversial in CIA history, an effort to use humans as guinea pigs for research into mind-altering drugs. The program was known as MK Ultra, and the details and scandals are basically what you'd expect from a secretive government program that is testing LSD and other drugs on unwitting subjects. Some really wild stuff in here, and here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hey, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Kellie, LSD, as people know, was developed in a lab. It is a synthetic drug. A lot of the early stories about LSD are of the people who were making it, sort of testing it on themselves. That's how you test the effects of a synthetic drug. So what is different when the government starts to get in on this testing?
Oh, man. I mean, the first thing I need to say is consent matters. Consent matters. And to that end, your purposes matter as well. The way the government is using these subjects are unwilling, and so they have not given permission for the government to use them in this way. And furthermore, the reason behind their, drug testing or drug use is so that they can develop all kinds of different techniques of mind control to use on foreign enemies. So how can we use hypnosis or trip people out or drug people up to get them to forget certain memories or drug people up in order to get them to become sort of like mental robots, that do the government's bidding. So none of the reasons are good, but most important is the fact that none of these people are willing to be used in this way.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Cold War era obsession with brainwashing and this belief that you can kind of turn people into blank slates and reprogram them. So there's kind of like a computer analogy that's happening that we can just like wipe the hard drive clean and put new stuff in there. And they're convinced, absolutely convinced, that the Chinese government and the Soviet government are not only experimenting in this, but they've cracked it. And so the U.S. needs to rush to catch up. And so the CIA, which was a new agency in 1947, some of the first things that they're doing is experimenting with these drugs, hoping that they can unlock the hard drive so that they can reprogram spies, that they can get people, like they can create a truth serum. There's all kinds of stuff they're trying to do.
And, just to paint some context, LSD was basically developed in the mid-40s. It starts to come out. So this is not long after. So, you're playing with something that there isn't really a body of knowledge of how it works. And then you are just sort of testing it in a bunch of different ways, as we are saying, on unwitting subjects. MK Ultra would come to include not just LSD experiments, but, MDMA, which is ecstasy, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and, hundreds of subjects, many of them unwitting, and pushing in all these directions. There were also, as I think you were saying, Kellie, Niki, there was this larger landscape of just using humans as guinea pigs and doing things like electroshock therapy, just all these ways to basically see how much you can control humans.
Yeah, I mean, it's this real moment in social sciences and behavioral psychology, where you're getting all of these experiments that are happening, some of them modeled after what was happening in concentration camps, some of it just experimenting with these new theories and techniques for how to change human behavior. And that then intersects with these new drugs. And so you have this really fertile period of really, in some ways, really bad experiments that are happening because you don't have those principles of consent, even though after the Nuremberg trials, there were new laws put on the books that forbade this kind of testing. And so a lot of MKUltra was done in contravention to international treaties about how you tested these kinds of things.
And if I can give a little bit more sort of cultural context, this happens on the same time that Ian Fleming debuts his first, James Bond novel, Casino Royale, and all of his novels, and all of the sort of the spin-offs that come after that. We think of not just James Bond, but Jason Bourne, and all these sort of spy movies in which some of the joy of reading these books is finding out how they, take some gadget and turn it into something else, or use hypnosis in order to get someone to become this like Manchurian candidate, to do the bidding of the government. I mean, it is something that I think gets exploited by literature, or maybe vice versa. But people are reading these very, very popular books, and there's a realm of possibility that I think people are sort of buying into about how this might be manipulated.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the Jason Bourne, movies. I haven't read the books, but I imagine it is based very much on MKUltra. I haven't actually sort of made that connection before. Should we just talk a little bit about some of the actual studies and some of the stuff that went down? Because it is, we're talking about programs where they are hiring prostitutes to slip drugs to suspects and watching them through two-way mirrors.
Yeah, and part of the idea there is that if you target someone who has hired a prostitute, that person is going to be too ashamed to come forward. So they're actually targeting communities and people where they can use shame against them. So if they are found out, no one's going to say anything because they don't want to admit that they were caught in a brothel or what have you.
But they're being roofied. They're being drugged without their knowledge. And so, to hold them accountable to the response that they have to some drug is not only not fair and unethical, but just wrong on so many levels. You don't have the ability to sort of respond in a way that would get you justice. I mean, this is because it's the CIA. There's not a lot of opportunities in order for you to get restitution or for the government to be on your side.
Yeah, especially if you don't know about it. And in the case of some people who did consent, because the CIA was saying free drugs, and there were plenty of people in the 50s and 60s who put up their hands and said, yes, please. But they were subjected to experiments like dosing them on LSD for 70 days straight, the kinds of things that you might consent to this experiment, but there can be long-term psychological damage as well as physical damage from being subjected to the kinds of levels of drugs that they were being given in some of these situations.
I would also say that, there's some pretty interesting people who reportedly volunteered to have access to their LSD. One of them is Robert Hunter, the Grateful Dead lyricist, Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, and then James Joseph Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mobster, was also allegedly a part of this experiment. So I think if there's anything to be said, it can have some pretty deadly consequences if not used properly.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, I think just word was out that this was the place to get your drugs at that point, right?
Yeah.
And so you had to sign up for a CIA experiment. Yeah. There's this interesting confluence that you're describing, which I haven't really fully got my head around. But, Timothy Leary comes out of academic studies of this, and, there's members of the Grateful Dead who had volunteered for CIA experiments. Think of that counterculture is so far away from academia and certainly the CIA, but actually a lot of those roots are in these experiments in this time. And this is also a moment where the tentacles of military research and development start to go out into academia. And so there's programs. It's not just the CIA running these programs, but they are funding programs, often funding if I'm right here, I think funding programs where the people receiving the funding don't even realize that the money's coming from the CIA or that this is a sort of doing the bidding of the CIA.
There's so much federal money flowing into the Cold War university and so many experiments that are being, in a way, kind of laundered through the universities. So sometimes there's clear CIA involvement and sometimes it's all behind the scenes. And so it gives it this sense of legitimacy or this idea that, well, it's just pure science, when in reality it's being funded by the government to use. And you read these stories about the CIA and you're just like, I don't know that these people should have access to money or information because they're doing the craziest stuff because they just have free reign to kind of do whatever they want because they're this well-funded secret agency and they just have a time with it.
You know, one element of this that I will say, just because I feel like I have a slight personal connection here, but, you know, my parents ran in circles with the children of a man named Dr. Frank Olson. And he was actually one of the people who, at least that we know for sure, there may have been more, but one of the people who actually died as a result of these secret experiments. So he was fed LSD, he had a sort of psychotic break, and he jumped out a window and died. And for decades, his sons fought for closure and information. And, you know, again, like, I remember as a kid hearing about this, and my initial reaction was, oh, this conspiracy theory, right? That the CIA killed my dad. And then, you know, 10, 15, 20 years later, it's like, nope, it was true. You know, he was part of these experiments and this is what happened. And so, you know, there's a real human cost here, and there's a real sort of effort to get justice around all of this.
And it's really important that we know that story because it is almost certainly true that other people had terrible consequences, including deaths caused by these experiments. But because it was blanketed in so much secrecy, we just don't know about them. But in this case, the CIA has admitted to this. They've paid restitution for it. It is one of those things that crosses over from conspiracy theory to just unveiled conspiracy.
Yeah, that's when you wonder if whether truth is crazier than fiction, because you can read these novels and be like, oh my gosh, there's no way, that would never happen, you know. And then, you know, you sort of read the documents and you're like, oh, they tried that? So I think that to me has probably been one of the most startling things, is that I could have read or seen any of these films and dismissed it as just okay, that's crazy or absurd, but there was a lot of legitimacy to that, and I think you hit the nail on the head too, Niki. Not just how they're laundering through universities, but legitimizing through universities the work that they're doing as research.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to this big thing that I think about a lot, that there's been a number of episodes we've done that have got me there, but, you know, it's just, there's this sort of patina of conspiratorial thinking around this, but then sometimes you realize, like, well, that comes from somewhere, right? And sometimes, certainly in this case, you know, I think MK Ultra has always had this, like, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, or, you know, the government is doing mind control, right? And then you look and you say, well, you know, these were actually happening, and it does, and part of it is because the information doesn't come out for a long time. And, you know, Niki, I think that's probably a good place to start to wrap up, is just point out that it's not for several decades later that we start to really learn what was going on here.
Right. And part of the reason we don't learn is because another part of the conspiracy, which is in 1973, the director of MK Ultra burns all of the files. And it's only because they found like 20,000 misfiled papers on it that we've learned as much as we have about MK Ultra. But, you know, by the mid-1970s, in part because there's this kind of left-wing skepticism of government, especially after Watergate, as well as a right-wing suspicion of government, there really is this moment of crisis. And the CIA gets thrust into the spotlight with things like the Church Committee hearings. There are revelations about all of the things the CIA has been up to, assassinations that they've carried out, these experiments that they've been doing, the surveilling of domestic organizations and the infiltration of just like every single radical group you hear about in the 1960s that has some CIA agents in it somewhere or some informants in it somewhere. And this all comes to light, and you realize the government has been surveilling and attacking its own people for decades, and it really does cement that idea that government can be really bad. And these intelligence agencies had to be restrained. And there are lots of laws passed in the 1970s about ethics and sunlight in government and constraints on government power precisely because they realize that the CIA has been up to hijinks for 20 years at that point.
Yeah, oversight is everything. It really is.
And we should give shout-outs to journalists in this regard. For instance, I think a lot of reporting by Cy Hirsch, a sort of legendary investigative reporter, uncovers a bunch of this along the way. But yeah, it does start to sort of crack wide open in the 70s. So as we start to wrap up, I do want to kind of talk a little bit. Maybe we'll do a proper episode about this at some point. But, the conversation around psychedelics in particular has really changed in recent years. I mean, there's all this interesting stuff going on where, for instance, and particularly on psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, but LSD as well. There's a whole rise in sort of microdosing around LSD. And then there's a whole conversation about the medical benefits of psilocybin. Oregon just legalized a lot of these drugs. Michael Pollan has written a really compelling book, I think, recently about the health benefits of this. And
Carl Hart has also written books about this as well.
Right. Yeah. And so, I just think it's a chance to look at the fact that the conversation about drugs has just been so shut down and sort of snapped back because of these sort of more sinister origins in some way and because of all sorts of other factors. But, we went from one extreme to the other and we're only slightly moving back, I think, to a real conversation about the fact that, like most things in the world, there are benefits and drawbacks to a lot of these things. But, I think that connects to MKUltra because it was such a sinister origin.
Yeah.
And then in the 70s when it got blown open, I think the reaction was really just like, shut it all down,
Yeah. And not only that, I think drugs have been stigmatized so much and penalized so much that we have not created a lot of space to be able to say, in a safe environment, how do we understand the utility of something like LSD? Are there aspects of it that might be useful or detrimental? And how do we, have a complete picture of this drug's components? And so I think we've shied a little bit away from that too much, but I think the more disturbing thing for me is just how much we have penalized people for it, and not allowed for a reckoning of understanding these drugs and their utility.
Yeah, and we should say, because they're listed as Schedule I narcotics, everything from marijuana on through psychedelics and the rest, they can't experiment on them. They're legally forbidden from doing these kinds of experiments in safer settings. And that's what's been so interesting as someone who grew up in the just say no 80s and in the times that all the scheduling was put into place and all of those harsh penalties you're talking about were put into place, to see not only the legalization of marijuana, but I think there's something really interesting happening, and we should do an episode on this, on the legalization of mushrooms and psychedelics. It's going to be really interesting to see the direction that goes in the next 10 to 20 years.
Or at the very least, compare it to how other countries around the world who don't have these restrictions, what is their life like?
Yeah. We are going to do it, not to spoil it, but yes, I'm also fascinated because of the weird political lines here too. There's this weird like conservative embrace of like things like ayahuasca or whatever. And so it's not just a sort of hippie, lefty kind of thing at this point, the drug conversation, especially around psychedelics. So there we go. Once again, we have booked a future episode as we wrap up one, but that is the end of this episode. So Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Thanks again to everyone who has reached out with comments and questions and potential topics. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Mr. Dulles, the CIA has been known as a super-secret organization. Do you think that's the way it should be?
I don't think that's the way it is. There's no intelligence service in the world that tells as much and talks as much and gives as much to the Congress as does the CIA.